That was the sound of a cheering crowd of protesters in Bristol, in the United Kingdom, as they pulled down the statue of 17th century slave trader Edward Colston on June 7, 2020. And welcome to the Maxwell Museum of Anthropology's exhibition, Iconoclasm, Questions of Veneration, Destruction, and Power. As long as humans have created symbols, others have sought to destroy them, creating cycles of veneration and destruction. Iconoclasm, the destruction of sacred images or representations, is so relevant to the work we do in anthropology museums, where a large part of what we do is preserve objects of cultural or ideological significance. This exhibition investigates current debates about iconoclasm. This introductory image shows the Deface statue of Confederate General Robert E. Lee on Monument Avenue in Richmond, Virginia on June 23, 2020. The statue has been a focal point of protests over the death of George Floyd, resulting in vandalism of the monument. On June 4th, Virginia Governor Ralph Northam ordered the removal of the statue, but that was met with a court-ordered temporary injunction halting that action. As of yet, the issue is unresolved. In this image, taken on June 8, 2020, a likeness of George Floyd and the acronym BLM is projected onto the same monument, in a laser projection project created by lighting director Dustin Klein for that ongoing protest. Increasingly, laser projections are becoming a form of intervention in temporary iconoclastic action, or a means to respond to iconoclasm at sites of protest and defacement. The acronym BLM stands for Black Lives Matter, which is a global organization and movement whose mission, in their own words, is to eradicate white supremacy and build local power to intervene in violence inflicted on Black communities by the state and vigilantes. This exhibition was displayed in the Maxwell Museum of Anthropology in 2018 as part of our Current Issues in Anthropology series. We have created this online version in July of 2020 with the ongoing protests in response to the killing of George Floyd in mind. We are in turbulent times and join you in reflecting on them. The Maxwell Museum also joins so many in expressing our anguish and frustrations in these times of unrest and a global pandemic. Some of the images and text in this exhibition have been updated. In this image, taken May 30th, 2020, during a protest for George Floyd, the widely hated statue of former Philadelphia Mayor Frank Rizzo was covered in graffiti. For many, Rizzo, also once Philadelphia Police Commissioner, was a symbol of the brutal treatment of Black people and other minorities at the hands of white police officers. The statue was removed by the city on June 3, 2020. To preface this updated exhibition, consider the words of former slave and abolitionist Frederick Douglass, a likeness of whom is seen in this image being projected on the same General Robert E. Lee Memorial. These words of Douglass's were invoked by Secretary of the Smithsonian Lonnie Bunch in a statement he made related to the protests about George Floyd's death. Douglass said, "Those who profess to favor freedom and yet depreciate agitation are people who want crops without plowing the ground. The struggle may be a moral one, or it may be a physical one, or it may be both, but it must be a struggle." Icons. Monuments, memorials, and collective memory. Before considering iconoclasm proper, that is, the destruction of valued or sacred cultural sites and symbols, it is helpful first to consider such sites, such as monuments and memorials themselves, and ask, what purpose do they serve? In this image, opera singer Marian Anderson is seen singing in front of the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. on April 9, 1939. Anderson performed this concert in front of 75,000 people after the Daughters of the American Revolution had her barred from singing in Washington, D.C.'s Constitution Hall because she was Black. The Lincoln Memorial was chosen as the site for this concert because of its symbolic heft. In broad terms, monuments, memorials, and similar material expressions of state or community identity are sites where collective memory is created and marked. In this image, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. delivers the "I Have a Dream" speech at the Lincoln Memorial at the March on Washington, August 28, 1963. Anthropological studies of such sites reflect that the materiality of monuments can elicit a collective mode of remembering, shaping our recall of the past and creating shared cultural memories that may or may not be related to the specific facts of past events, but regardless, can be powerful places of emotional, communal, and contested experience. Here again in this image, the Lincoln Memorial, with demonstrators gathering during a protest against racial inequality on June 6, 2020. In some instances, such memorializing sites may also be places where we are asked to forget as well as to remember, directing us to select certain versions of history and events while obscuring others. In this final image at the Lincoln Memorial, President Donald Trump is interviewed by Fox News anchors on May 3, 2020. Though most events had been banned at the memorial due to the coronavirus, U.S. Secretary of the Interior David Bernhardt granted an exception for this event. Iconoclasm. Iconoclasm is the destruction of sacred images or representations. Originally, iconoclasm referred to the destruction of actual icons, as major religious leaders and their followers sought to ban the veneration of sacred images, images representing Christian saints, the Virgin Mary, and Christ, during Byzantine and Protestant Reformation eras. Here we see a detail from the 9th century Cludolf Psalter, or Book of Psalms. The image represents the iconoclast theologian John the Grammarian and the iconoclast bishop destroying an image of Christ. The Cludolf Psalter is the oldest of 3 remaining illuminated Byzantine psalters to survive the 9th century, when iconoclasm, in the original sense of the word, was at its height. Over time, the term has expanded to include the destruction of symbols of cherished beliefs, people, or institutions, such as monuments, memorials, flags, and other such material manifestations of cultural capital. In this image, an engraving from about 1875, the Sons of Freedom, a mixed group of civilian New Yorkers and George Washington soldiers, stirred up by the public reading of the Declaration of Independence, pulled down the statue of the British monarch George III at Bowling Green in the city of New York in July of 1776. The statue, reportedly made of solid lead and gilded in gold, was moved to Connecticut and later used to make guns and bullets. It would seem as long as humans have created symbols, others have sought to destroy them, creating cycles of veneration and destruction. Religious zealots have destroyed the idols required by other forms of worship or even their own religion's icons. In this image, one of the 2 6th or 7th century Buddha images in Bamiyan, Afghanistan, before their destruction by the Taliban in 2001. The Buddhas, considered the largest in the world before their destruction, were carved into a side of a cliff. The motivation behind their destruction was part of the Taliban's extreme iconoclastic campaign, as well as their resentment of Western efforts and resources poured into protecting the statues, while there was, at the same time, a large humanitarian crisis in the region that was largely being ignored. In June of 2015, 2 Chinese documentarians, Jason Yu and Lian Hu, created and projected 3D holograms of the Bamiyan Buddhas into the empty niches where they once stood, as a temporary recreation and counteraction to the destruction of the statues 14 years earlier. In other acts of iconoclasm over the ages, colonizers have destroyed the sacred sites and other rallying points of the peoples they sought to conquer. In this image from the 16th century book by mestizo historian of New Spain, Diego Muñoz Camargo, Catholic friars are seen destroying images of Aztec deities and religious paraphernalia. As political regimes defeat rivals, they also remove or transform the symbols that represent the former order. Erecting or destroying monuments doesn't just reflect authority, but is also a way to promote or change it. In this image, the damaged and decapitated head of a statue of Stalin on Grand Avenue, Budapest, sits in the middle of the street. The statue was destroyed on October 23, 1956, by enraged anti-Soviet crowds during Hungary's uprising against Soviet rule. In another image, a U.S. soldier watches as a statue of the former leader of Iraq, Saddam Hussein, falls in central Baghdad's Firdos Square, April 2003. The statue was pulled down by American Marines as the war in Iraq was just getting underway. In this image, a complicated history of colonization manifests in acts of protest and iconoclasm in Hong Kong, when a man contributes to the defacement of an image of Chinese President Xi Jinping in October of 2019. Much property has been defaced or destroyed during the Hong Kong anti-government protests, including sites reflecting Chinese history and governmental ties. The protests, which are ongoing, are a response to Hong Kong transitioning from British to Chinese rule, and expresses the desire of protesters to retain their independence, in this instance from China. In some instances, both in the United States and around the globe, indigenous and/or disenfranchised communities, groups, or individuals, as well as those that support or sympathize with their plight, have inverted the script on the colonial narrative, taking down or vandalizing public works that honor colonists, colonization, or other odes to empire. Just one such example, seen in this image from November 2019, is the decapitation of a statue in Temuco, Chile, of the Chilean military aviator Dagoberto Godoy. His head was hung by protesters from the arm on a statue of the Mapuche warrior Capolican, now also holding the Mapuche flag, or Winafoye. In another related example, on June 27, 2015, 10 days after a white supremacist with an affinity for the Confederate battle flag killed 9 African American parishioners of Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church, protester Bree Newsom climbed the 30-foot flagpole in front of the State House in Columbia, South Carolina, and pulled down the Confederate flag. And now, beginning in June of 2020, many organizations and local and state governments have begun banning the display of the Confederate flag, such as seen here, with the retirement of the Mississippi state flag on July 2, 2020. The retired flag was the last U.S. state banner featuring a Confederate emblem. In this image, the bust of King Leopold II of Belgium was removed from a park in Ghent on June 30, 2020. The date was the 60th anniversary of the Democratic Republic of Congo's independence from Belgium. The people of the Congo in Central Africa had experienced unimaginable suffering after their land was colonized by King Leopold in the mid-19th century. Estimates of the number of Congolese killed during his 44-year reign range from 2 to 15 million. The bust was removed after being vandalized by those opposed to honoring the memory of the former king and colonizer. Iconoclasm deeply interests anthropology museums, which preserve objects of cultural or ideological significance. However, removing objects from their original contexts can be part of the destruction of cultures and assertions of political power. Can the collection of objects from other cultures be a form of iconoclasm? It is not just the display of images or objects of veneration that correlate to questions of power, but also the context in which they are accumulated and displayed. In this image, the activist group Culture Beyond Oil protests in front of the Hoa Hakanana Eye in the Living and Dying Gallery at the British Museum in July of 2010. This iconoclastic protest was in response to the British Museum accepting sponsorship money from BP, the British Petroleum Company. So, for example, in addition to being ritual objects, works of art, and historical documents, Benin bronze plaques and carved ivories also serve to document historical interactions between the Benin Empire and Europe. Those stories, however, may be fragmented, owing to the manner in which the plaques and ivories were removed from their original context. Here you see these objects pictured with William Downing Webster, one of the most famous dealers of ethnographic objects of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. It was Britain's so-called punitive expedition of 1897 which destroyed the kingdom's capital, Benin City. The accompanying looting, which could also be considered an act of iconoclasm, scattered many of these plaques and ivories into new networks of circulation. Pictured here, British soldiers surrounded by looted works of art from that time. These networks of circulation include museum collections, such as the Pitt Rivers Museum, the British Museum, and the Maxwell Museum of Anthropology. The display of Benin plaques or ivories in Western museums tells a different history of the Kingdom of Benin than the royal history of its Oba or king. In this image, a pre-20th century brass waist pendant plaque from the collection of the Maxwell Museum of Anthropology. Iconoclasm, the national debate. In the United States, many current debates of the last few years about iconoclasm center on the memorials of colonists, particular political figures, and Confederate soldiers, whose venerated status is increasingly a matter of sometimes violent disagreement. In this image, a protester kicks the toppled statue of a Confederate soldier after it was pulled down at the old Durham County Courthouse, August 14, 2017, in Durham, North Carolina. In another example from 2017, on August 21st of that year, at the University of Texas, Austin, statues of two Confederate generals, Robert E. Lee, pictured here, and Albert Sidney Johnston, and the Confederate cabinet member John Reagan, were removed. This was following the removal of a statue of Jefferson Davis in 2015. These examples illustrate that beginning in the 20-teens, there was an uptick in public interest in the histories and appropriateness of various monuments and memorials honoring the Confederacy of the U.S. Civil War, with a particular jump in interest and attendant iconoclasm beginning in August 2017. In 2017, Charlottesville, Virginia became the epicenter of the national debate on race. On August 11, 2017, white nationalists descended on Charlottesville and on the University of Virginia campus for a Unite the Right rally, protesting the plan to remove a statue of Confederate General Robert E. Lee. During the violence that erupted, counter-protester Heather Heyer was killed. In this image, torch-bearing white nationalists gather around the base of a statue during a demonstration in Charlottesville, Virginia on August 11, 2017. The statue they are gathered around is of Thomas Jefferson, not the statue of Robert E. Lee proposed for removal. The group of white nationalists gathered there to surround a small group of counter-protesters who positioned themselves at the base of that statue. The confrontation was covered widely on national news and inspired further acts of vandalism and iconoclasm, focused on monuments that nominally honor the Confederacy. Opponents of the monuments point to the fact that most were erected to legitimize continued white dominance of Southern society. Indeed, Robert E. Lee himself, the losing general of the Civil War, had denounced the construction of monuments, writing in 1869 in response to a proposal to build a monument at Gettysburg. He said, quote, "I think it wiser, moreover, not to keep open the sores of war, but to follow the examples of those nations who endeavored to obliterate the marks of civil strife, to commit to oblivion the feelings engendered," end quote. The erection of the majority of Confederate monuments fueling conflict today occurred in the early to mid-20th century, organized and funded by various individuals and groups sympathetic to the Confederate cause. The United Daughters of the Confederacy, or UDC, an organization of Southern white women founded in Nashville in 1894, chief among them. In this image, members of the Atlanta delegation of the UDC at their convention in Albany, Georgia in 1930. They pose in front of a marble sculpture dedicated to, quote, "our Confederate dead," end quote, that was erected in downtown Albany in 1901. The statue still stands, residing in the privately owned Confederate Memorial Park. At its founding, the UDC had 30 members. It grew to about 100,000 women by the 19-teens, with a goal to, according to Karen Cox, professor of history at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte, quote, "preserve and perpetuate the myths that the Confederate cause was a just and honorable one, and that the states' rights, not slavery, was its call to arms," end quote. In this image, a monument to Jefferson Davis, President of the Confederate States from 1861 to 1865, marking the spot where Deface was captured by Union soldiers on May 10, 1865. The monument was erected by Ocilla, Georgia chapter of the United Daughters of the Confederacy on June 3, 1936, almost 70 years after the end of the Civil War. The memorial still stands in Irwinville, Georgia today. More recently, protests against Columbus Day have been accompanied by acts of iconoclasm aimed at representations of Christopher Columbus. Many opponents of Columbus Day believe that it should be replaced with Indigenous Peoples Day to recognize the violence inflicted on the original inhabitants of the Americas by Columbus and later colonizers. In this image, a statue of Christopher Columbus in Central Park was vandalized on October 3, 2017. One of the many that have been vandalized or removed in the intervening years. Very recently, with the civil unrest sparked by the George Floyd protests, many memorials in the United States, those of government officials and political or historical figures with contentious histories, Confederate soldiers and colonizers, have begun to be removed by state and local officials or defaced, pulled down, or destroyed by protesters. This statue of Columbus at the Minnesota State Capitol was pulled down by protesters on June 10, 2020. As already mentioned, museums are not spared such responses in relation to the collections they hold, the funding they receive, and the memorials that are often part of their architecture and settings. On October 26, 2017, an organization calling themselves the Monument Removal Brigade splashed red paint on a statue of Theodore Roosevelt in front of the American Museum of Natural History in New York. A published statement released by the group on the internet called for the removal of the statue as an emblem of, quote, patriarchy, white supremacy, and settler colonialism, end quote, as they asked the museum to, quote, rethink its cultural halls regarding the colonial mentality behind them, end quote. Although the museum opened an exhibition entitled Addressing the Statue, a graphic from the exhibition pictured here, that asked the public to weigh in on the controversy over the Roosevelt sculpture, many felt that was not enough. And on June 21, 2020, after many years of controversy, the museum announced the removal of the sculpture that many have argued depicts Black and Indigenous people as subjugated and racially inferior. Iconoclasm, regional debate in New Mexico. On September 30, 2017, the front page of the New York Times highlighted the saga of the statue of Spanish colonizer Juan de Oñate, erected in 1993 in Alcalde, New Mexico. In January 1998, the statue's right foot was removed. The act recalled the 1598 battle between Oñate's Spanish forces and the village of Acoma. After winning the battle, Oñate severely punished the people of Acoma. Many Acoma men over the age of 25 had one foot cut off and then were forced into 20 years of penal servitude. This 2017 image shows the man who said that 20 years prior, he had cut off the right foot of the Don Juan de Oñate statue in Alcalde, New Mexico. The individuals who anonymously removed the foot from the statue sent photographs of it and the following statement to local newspapers. Quote, we invite you to visit the Oñate Distortion Museum and Visitor Center, located 8 miles north of Española. We took the liberty of removing Oñate's right foot on behalf of our brothers and sisters of Acoma Pueblo, end quote. The people who originally commissioned the statue subsequently had a new foot made. In 2017, the statue was once again vandalized when, as seen in the image here, the right foot of Oñate was painted red in advance of a protest held in Santa Fe on September 8th of the same year. The protest, organized by Native American activists, disrupted the Entrada, the annual reenactment of the 1692 return of the Spanish to New Mexico after the Pueblo Revolt of 1680. Other New Mexican acts of iconoclasm have focused on public monuments and traditions, particularly in the state capital of Santa Fe. One such event, pictured here, occurred on the Santa Fe Plaza on August 14, 2017, led by a group of indigenous activists participating in an anti-racist rally. As the crowd for the rally thinned, a small group of activists took to the stage while others positioned themselves in front of the monument pictured here. They began chanting, "The Entrada is racist," a reference to the Entrada de Don Diego de Vargas, which celebrates Spanish colonists' return to Santa Fe in 1692. When the monument, an obelisk, was erected in 1868, the phrase, "To the heroes who have fallen in various battles with savage Indians in the territory of New Mexico," was inscribed on its marble base. In 1974, an individual illegally chiseled out the word savage. The word was never restored. In 2019, the Entrada was abolished. Iconoclasm, Regional Debate in New Mexico, Epilogue and Prologue. In recent turns of events, as pictured here on June 15, 2020, Rio Arriba County removed the sculpture of Don Juan de Oñate, not in response to protests, but rather to protect it from protesters, who were scheduled to protest its removal later that day. The protest did go forward, and the fate of the sculpture remains a question. On the same day, June 15, 2020, a University of New Mexico student was shot and seriously wounded in Albuquerque when he was peacefully protesting in support of the removal of the monument called La Jornada, which features several sculpted images including Juan de Oñate leading oxen-drawn carts and families involved in the Spanish colonization of the Southwest in 1598. The monument, pictured here being prepared to be pulled down by protesters, was located on the property of the Albuquerque Museum, Antigua Park. Albuquerque Mayor Tim Keller had the monument removed, stating, quote, "The city will be removing the statue until civic institutions can determine next steps," end quote. Police took into custody several members of a right-wing militia group, the New Mexico Civil Guard, and a one-time Albuquerque City Council candidate was charged related to the shooting. On June 18th, the mayor of Santa Fe, Alan Weber, signed a proclamation announcing the removal of 3 controversial monuments related to New Mexico's history of colonization by first the Spanish and later the United States. These include a statue of Don Diego de Vargas, an obelisk commemorating the life of Kit Carson, and another obelisk honoring U.S. Union soldiers of the Civil War. This proclamation in turn sparked counter-protests, though the proclamation currently stands. In this image, the obelisk in front of the U.S. courthouse in Santa Fe honoring frontiersman Kit Carson, having been vandalized with the words, "Stolen Land," on June 17, 2020. The obelisk shape as memorial itself is interesting. An Egyptian shape taken to Europe first by the Romans in the 1st century CE as a way to express and assert Roman power. Later in the 18th and 19th centuries, being adopted as a symbol of imperialism and empire by Napoleon, Queen Victoria, famed American businessman William H. Vanderbilt, and the United States government. 8 years earlier, Navajo artist Will Wilson created a video with the monument, a still from which is seen here, as an intervention on the monument. And not unlike the projections on monuments seen at the beginning of this exhibition, his work serves as an act of virtual and ephemeral iconoclasm. Iconoclasm, Regional Debate at the University of New Mexico. In Albuquerque, home to the University of New Mexico campus, similar protests and acts of iconoclasm have taken place. Beginning in 2015, after student and local protests, the city of Albuquerque now recognizes Indigenous Peoples Day. And in 2019, after years of protest and various acts of iconoclasm, the University of New Mexico has stopped using a seal that celebrates Spanish and Anglo colonists while ignoring Native Americans. In this image from April 29, 2016, Nick Estes, in the center of the photograph, leads a group of protesters burning copies of UNM's official seal. Estes is a former University of New Mexico student activist and now a UNM assistant professor, and one of the founders of the Red Nation, a coalition of Native and non-Native activists, educators, students, and community organizers, advocating Native liberation based in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Iconoclasm, further national update. George Floyd, a 46-year-old African American, was killed on May 25, 2020. He died with his hands handcuffed behind him while white Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin knelt on his neck for nearly 9 minutes. In the days and weeks that have followed, numerous and ongoing protests have been taking place in the United States and around the globe over his death, over police brutality, and over the history of racism. This image exemplifies acts of iconoclasm taking place as part of the protests surrounding the murder of George Floyd. On June 5, 2020, 14-year-old ballerinas Kennedy George and Ava Holloway posed in front of the monument of Confederate General Robert E. Lee in Richmond, Virginia, a memorial already much addressed in this exhibition. Increasingly, as in previous examples, when officials have been unwilling or slow to act, protesters have been taking matters into their own hands. On June 7, 2020, a statue of Edward Colston, a late 17th century slave trader, was toppled by protesters and pushed into the River Avon in Bristol, in the United Kingdom. In this image, Fran Coles, Bristol City Council conservation manager, works on preserving the graffiti on the Deface statue, which will be displayed in a museum in Bristol, accompanied by the story of how the statue was both erected and toppled. However, even those who agree with removing statuary that honors those who represent oppressive or racist views and actions have argued that such actions run the risk of removing reminders of a troubled history that we would do well to remember. One such contested call for removal involves the controversial Emancipation Memorial in Lincoln Park in Washington, D.C., seen in this photograph from the 1880s, some years after it was erected. The memorial depicts a freed slave kneeling at the feet of President Abraham Lincoln. Racial justice protesters want the monument removed, saying the imagery, that of a freed slave crouching at Lincoln's feet, is offensive, despite the fact that the memorial was originally commissioned and paid for by Black people after the Civil War. At the same time, the man who was the model for the figure of the slave, Archer Alexander, who was born a slave in Virginia in 1813, escaped to freedom decades before posing for the memorial, so in fact was not freed by Lincoln. Seen here is a contemporary photograph of that memorial, which was unveiled in April of 1876. At that time, the abolitionist Frederick Douglass wrote a letter to the newspaper, The New Republic, voicing his discontent with the statue, saying, quote, "The Negro here, though rising, is still on his knees and nude. What I want to see before I die is a monument representing the Negro, not couchant on his knees like a four-footed animal, but erect on his feet like a man. There's room in Lincoln Park for another monument, and I throw out this suggestion to the end that it may be taken up and acted upon." End quote. These words, written by Douglass, were only recently rediscovered by historian Scott Sandage of Carnegie Mellon University. Sandage has been advocating for the removal of the statue, though other historians argue for its preservation. Contemporary artists have been issuing responses to the more recent vocal outcry about troublesome monuments too. One such response comes from the American artist Kehinde Wiley, in which he acknowledges the troubled past while introducing a new icon in his equestrian statue, Rumors of War, seen here on temporary display in Times Square, New York City, in September of 2019. The sculpture depicts an African-American man in dreadlocks, a hoodie, ripped jeans, and Nike high tops, but takes the form of the heroic equestrian statue of Confederate generals of Monument Avenue in Richmond, Virginia. Another example seen here comes from the Tlingit and Unangoks artist Yal Yatsen Nicholas Galinan with his contribution to the 2020 Biennial of Sydney in Hyde Park, Shadow on the Land, an Excavation and Bush Burial. The work is a grave that has been dug for the widely reviled statue that is erected there of Captain James Cook, the 18th century British Royal Navy captain who landed in what is now Australia. In turbulent times of rapidly changing public opinion and politics, it remains to be seen what previous symbols endure or are subjected to acts of iconoclasm, and what new icons are given public space. In this final image, we circle back to where we began, with the protests over the killing of George Floyd. Muriel Bowser, the mayor of Washington, D.C., renamed a street near the White House Black Lives Matter Plaza and had muralists paint Black Lives Matter in roughly 50-foot wide yellow letters on a section of 16th Street that sits just in front of Lafayette Park, June 5, 2020, altering the area conceptually and literally, which some have considered a defacement and others have celebrated. Lafayette Park sits directly across from the White House. Named for a French hero of the American Revolution, the Marquis de Lafayette. The park, sometimes referred to as the People's Park, was created by Thomas Jefferson and is iconic both for its location and for the celebrations and protests it has hosted over the centuries.